So, good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us today on this beautiful Tuesday morning. So, my name is Katya, and I'm just going to just say hi to everyone and just get things started. I'll kick things off. So, today's webinar is on fake news, disinformation, and misinformation. And it's a little collaboration we've done here with the ACTLab at Concordia University. So the flow for today is Scott, who I will be passing the torch to in 2 seconds, is going to do his presentation. And then we're going to jump straight into the Q&A, and that will be Andrew, who's my partner in crime here at Seniors Action Quebec. So he'll do the Q&A. And then that is the goal for today. So it should be about an hour and a half. But just before I pass the puck to Scott, and Andrew just sent me a reminder, thank you. I just want to thank our funders, which is the Department of Canadian Heritage, for allowing us to produce these webinars. So I think I've done my housekeeping. So Scott, over to you. You can introduce yourself and just talk a bit more about the ACTLab.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. My name is Scott. I actually have a slide in the presentation that will explain my work a bit more. But I'm a student here at Concordia University. I'm a PhD student in communication studies, and I'm looking forward to talking to you all about some of the questions, concerns, stresses that we might have about false content online and how we might deal with it. But I do want to thank Seniors Action Quebec for the invite, as well as the ACT and AID Lab at Concordia, ACT Lab and AID project, or Aging and Data Research Project at Concordia, for helping organize this event. For those who don't know, the ACTLab is a multi-methodological research hub at Concordia University that brings together researchers, students, activists, and artists to address the transformation of their experiences of aging with the proliferation of new forms of mediated communications and network societies. Aging in Data is a research project funded by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council to investigate issues related to aging and the increased reliance on data to make critical decisions about all aspects of society. I have worked with ACT and AID in the past. We've done some cool stuff where we've designed escape rooms around older adult mistreatment, as well as some really interesting research on communication telecom prices in Canada. So why your phone costs so much. But they do a lot of other really cool and interesting work that if you're interested in, I encourage you to check out. I'm going to do the thing now where I attempt to share my screen flawlessly with no efforts at all. So I'm going to share my screen. Hopefully you can see a thing that will be the presentation. And hopefully when I click this button, you don't see my notes. And if I get a thumbs up from Brendan, then I'm going
You're
to
all
feel
good.
like life is good. Amazing. Okay, fantastic. So again, thank you for being here today. I hope that this is helpful for you. And as they have already informed you, please ask your questions in the chat. It's going to be hard for me to check them while I'm going, but that's what the Q&A for is after. So just type them out, write them down, and we'll try to get to all of them that we can today. I titled this presentation, Navigating Truth Online. Perhaps that's an overly optimistic title, but it's the idea of how do we kind of get to the bottom of these false ideas and false content that's out there. And so the goal today is 4 parts. There's 4 things that we're going to do. The first thing is I'm going to talk to you about what is misleading content. So what is disinformation? What is misinformation? What is fake news? What are all these words we keep hearing? Why is this a concern? Why should we care? Why does this matter? Then we're going to talk about how we can identify it. And then we're going to talk about how we can deal with it. And so hopefully that's a nice way to get some understanding of what's going on and what we can do about it all. As promised, I told you I would give a bit more information about who I am, so I'm not just a random guy up here in front of you all. My name is Scott DeJong. I refer to myself as an educator, a designer, and a researcher. I used to be an elementary school teacher before coming to do my grad school studies. I worked in kindergarten to grade 6 classrooms. I had a great time there, but I got a chance to pursue grad studies here at Concordia, and I took the opportunity. What I do in my research is I study false information in Canada. I look at alt-right, alt-left, as well as conspiracy theory groups in Canada and see how they're spreading false ideas. And then I create games like board games or card games as tools to try to have people make sense of these issues. So I work with school teachers and librarians as well as other scholars to try to get to how do we deal with all this false information going around online. If that interests you, I'm also a member of the Applied AI Institute here at Concordia University, the Machine Agencies Group at Concordia, and the Technoculture Art and Games Institute. So first question was, what is misleading content? In other words, what are all these words or kind of terms we keep hearing people use around, whether it's in the news or in papers that we've read, around incorrect or manipulative content online. Perhaps you've even come across false news in your own time. Perhaps you've been scrolling social media, or a friend has sent you an article. You're like, that doesn't sound right, and you looked it up and you realized it was fake, or someone else told you that it was fake. There's so much content out there, and so it's important to try to understand all these different things that come into what we talk about when we're talking about disinformation or false news. And so here's some of the big ones. These are the ones that I use in the work that I'm doing. These are the big terms that as researchers we use. I like to use the general term misleading content because it tries to summarize all of these big words into one thing. But we have misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation. These are kind of three words you may or may not hear in the things you read. And the simple difference between them is the difference around intent and the difference around harm. So misinformation is unintentional, but it's false. So that might be a friend sends you an article because they think that it would matter for you and they think it's important to you, but it's actually incorrect. When I first moved to Montreal, my grandmother sent me an article about how squirrels were attacking citizens. It was completely false, but she was worried for me. I have yet to be attacked by a squirrel. It's been great, but we would deem that as something called misinformation because it was unintentional. Whereas disinformation is intentionally false. It's people writing articles or news stories or posts online that are meant to deceive you. A really good example would be, let's say you're in the grocery store and you're at the checkout and you see those like celebrity magazines and they're still talking about like the Princess Diana conspiracy theory, and all those pieces like that. Those are intentionally false. They're intentionally misleading you, but they're going to catch your eye, they're going to draw your attention, and you're going to engage with them. That's one example of disinformation. There's also lots of political disinformation that people are really worried about, but we can get into that a bit later. Finally, there's malinformation, and this is something you probably are less familiar with hearing, but this is content that's targeted and is really harmful to specific people. So this is people who online are spreading racism, or people online who are doing cyberbullying or extortion, where they're trying to target someone and cause harm to their lives. And that gets wrapped into these ideas of misleading content. But wait, there's actually even more terms that we can use. Sometimes you've probably heard the term scams or conspiracy theories or fake news. These are three other big terms that we hear. And again, I wrap them into this idea of misleading content because at the end of the day, it's content online that's trying to misinform you or mislead you in a wrong direction. So scams, I think you have actually had a workshop or a talk on scams, so I'm not going to get too much into them, but pretty much it's dishonest, fraudulent content, typically focused on making you lose money. It's, you know, those calls that you'll get that aren't actually real on your phone that are like, you owe the Canadian government so many dollars, call us back and we'll help make sure you pay them back. That's a scam. Never fall for them. If in doubt, just ask the actual organization. Please don't fall for scams. Conspiracy theories, these are like grand narratives. They take little bits of truth and they weave them together into this large story that sounds really enticing and it's intriguing and you get into it, but a lot of it's actually made up or misleading or false. Conspiracies are kind of meant to kind of bring you down this rabbit hole of ideas and distrust, and typically they have a narrative that there is a large secret group that's trying to manipulate the public or harm the public or cause damage to society. Conspiracies are very much into those regards, and we can talk more about that if you have questions about those later on. And finally, there's fake news. This is probably the word you're most familiar with hearing. In general, when people say fake news, they're referring to mainstream media being intentionally incorrect. This word got really big in 2016 when Donald Trump pointed at a reporter and went, "You're fake news." And the term kind of had a resurgence where now mainstream media has come under fire a lot for being fake news, even in cases when they aren't. And it has created kind of divides and tension in those spaces. So that's all those kind of terms that I throw together around misleading content, which is, again, a term that we use to talk about all those things online that are trying to misinform us, mislead us, or kind of make us think about things in different ways. Now, I can always tell you definitions, but I like to also show examples of what those definitions might be, right? So I mentioned before, a good example of disinformation might be those magazines you might see at the checkout of a store, right? This image here where you have a lot of really glaringly strong headlines that draw your attention so that you pick up the magazine, you spend a few bucks and you have it. But you might have also seen on YouTube or on video feeds these kind of like lose belly fat with only 3 tablespoons a day kind of posts, or this plant will cure all of your concerns around cancer, are things that I've seen online too. And those are also misleading, right? They're trying to there's some kind of health thing that may or may not even work. I would have to look at the specific ones to tell you, but they're trying to create grand assumptions and arguments about certain things in order to get you to purchase their product or click further into their thing or just read their article. Because you reading things online, you clicking on things online can generate money for people. And so that's why they do some of these things. I also have the example of just another fake news article where it's really popular for people to write fake articles about celebrities dying, because when people are like, "Oh my goodness, this celebrity died," they'll get all excited or sad or emotional, and they'll engage with it and they'll read it and go from there. I have another example here. This is from a um, pseudo news company in Canada. They refer to themselves as news, but many of us would refer to them as alternative news because a lot of their news has been disproven or fact checked to be false, called Rebel News. I went onto their website 2 weeks ago when I was making this presentation, and this was on the front page, which said, "Stop the censorship. Justin Trudeau is coming to kill Rebel News with draconian censorship plan that will silence everyday Canadians." Right? And so we can just look at that and we can see the language being used here is very clearly trying to get a certain idea to make the public think a certain way. Draconian censorship plan alone is a very specific way of phrasing, and the "we must stop him again" is a very particular way of phrasing, which is trying to make you think that there's this larger conspiracy around silencing Canadians, which, if we start to get to the facts, is not necessarily always the case. So these are just some examples, but the real questions people always get to when I start talking about like what is it is, okay, so why should I care? What's all the hubbub? Why are we worried? Why are people stressed about it? What's the big deal? And why do we care now? Right? So you might remember COVID a few years ago. The world had a lot of anxiety and panic about what to do. We weren't sure if we should wear masks, what we should wear masks. I remember going to the grocery store at the start of COVID, wearing winter gloves to be like, well, maybe this works, because none of us really had answers at the start, and there was a lot of questions. And it was in these moments where there's a lot of uncertainty that is really easy to interject kind of false ideas or misleading ideas, because some of it will come across as misinformation where people are unintentionally false because they're trying to be helpful. And some of it is disinformation because they're trying to rally up support for a certain perspective, which can then be used for other purposes in the future. In the work that I'm doing, we saw politicians and political groups start to take sides about how to deal with our health. And in doing so, it led to the public getting confused about what kind of things they should be doing in response to COVID 19. But simply, when we think about this historically, this is a long problem, right? Misleading content in general, in short, is people lying. It's us lying. People are lying to you online in some capacity. And lying is something that goes back before the internet, much, much longer before the internet, arguably since the dawn of time, though I'm not going to go that ridiculously far back, where the idea of trying to lie to people to get them to agree with you or support you or engage with you is a practice that we see happening. The reason people are concerned today, I'll go through a few in a second, but primarily is because social media makes a lot of these lies really quickly believable, quick to spread around, and you can reach broad audiences. And so, disinformation, misleading content, these are long-standing things, but the reasons people are concerned today is because it's more frequent, more prevalent, and we're seeing the impacts happening at a much more rapid fire pace. And so here are kind of the four main reasons that scholars will write about when they're talking about the problems of disinformation, misleading content, or fake news. So the first one is political manipulation, whereas you can use false content or misleading content to make people think about politics in a certain way. You can shift them to lean a bit more to the political left or shift them to lean a little bit more to the political right. And in doing, or you can just reinforce what they already think, right? So if they think that X idea is bad, you can just keep reinforcing that that idea is bad, and people will start to get more into these camps of people who disagree with me are wrong, which can lead to tensions and conflict. You also have this loss of trust, right? As more and more content online is trying to mislead us, and so more and more content online is not actually true, it makes us as users, as the public, start to wonder, well, what is true? Who can I trust? What can I trust? When we start calling everything fake news, it becomes hard to believe, well, then what is real news? if we want to use the alternative terms. And so people start to lose trust in the systems that are there. There's also the whole loss of money that we see that a lot in the scams discussion, but there are entire industries out there that are designed to mislead the public. Politicians will pay people to implement certain content on social media to make people lean and think a certain way. There is money involved in these systems, and it's part of the reason that they're growing in strength. And last, and kind of related to manipulation side, is civil disruption, which is as we start to see content that either reinforces how we see the world or makes us worried about other things in the world, we start to get into these like little camps. We start to get ideologically like, this is how I see the world. Anyone who doesn't see the world like me is clearly wrong or messed up, or there's something crazy about them. And it creates tension, it creates confusion, it creates anger, and it causes unrest. And most of us be like, well, why would we want unrest? That seems like something most people wouldn't want. Um, However, if you think about it from a larger perspective, having the public at odds with each other destabilizes our country. And so we'll see people talk about like foreign interference from other countries because there's countries that would like Canada to be a little bit more destabilized. And so causing civic unrest allows that to happen. Additionally, people getting into ideological camps, so me being like, this is the way I see the world and this is the way that is right and any other way is wrong, that makes it really easy to get voted in, right? You can be like, okay, well, I agree with you, so vote for me, and don't vote for that guy because he completely disagrees with you. And it allows people to kind of manipulate public to think and believe a certain ways. So those are kind of the main reasons. But I want to be clear that a lot of this will sound doomy and gloomy, and that's not my goal here today. My goal here today is to kind of inform you of the basics here. And so I want to let you know, and that's why I had to put the slide in, is that the internet is not all bad. Okay, it allows us to connect with our friends and family. It gives us access to an array of ideas, information, and perspectives, right? Like now more than ever, if we have a question, we can type it into Google and we can get a mostly correct answer. We shouldn't trust everything that Google immediately sends back to us, but for the most part, we can get quick answers to questions that we have in ways that we weren't able before. I'm sure some of you remember going to the library, or you still maybe do this today, and grabbing an encyclopedia off the shelf and like combing through the pages to try to get your answer. Today, so many digital encyclopedias exist that you don't have to do that same level of effort to get that information. It also provides spaces where we can share, right? I can share art that I create with my friends overseas. I can connect with people in ways that I haven't been able to do before. I can also simplify tasks. And now I think this is one that sometimes people are too optimistic about. We talk about how we can do all of our forms and medical stuff online. And I know that some people actually find that to be more of a challenge because they're not designed to be accessible. But there's this idea that technology can do that for us. And if we roll it out properly with good media literacy, sometimes it can happen. However, I personally think that we don't want to oversimplify everything because having a human component is important in some of these processes as well. Nevertheless, back to the concerns. But remember, there are good things to do with the internet. So, the concerns that we have, to summarize the points that I was making, rests about how people can be informed and protected. The idea is community being lost or is it being created? So, the concerns that we have as scholars and as educators is how do I make sure that the public is aware of these issues, can make sense of these issues, and recognizes that they're in these communities, but there's also worlds beyond these communities that think in different ways, and that's okay, and we can engage in them in meaningful conversation. Um, and so this becomes to the question of like what is being done about it. You're probably maybe you're sitting there and you're like, Scott, you've told me a lot of things that sound not great. There's got to be someone out there doing something to stop it. And so there is an answer. People are trying to do things. I'll tell you kind of the three main approaches that we see, and then we'll talk about what you can do. So these are the three main things that you'll see being done to try to deal with false ideas, false content online. We have moderation, regulation, and media literacy. So moderation, this is the companies. This is like your Facebooks, your Twitters, your Instagrams, your TikToks. This is saying the company should manage and control what content's on their feed. So if there's a post on Facebook, Facebook should be responsible for making sure that post is not incorrect. And companies sometimes will fight back and forth about how much they're responsible because they're going to say, well, you're the one that posted it, you should be responsible. But at the end of the day, they do have fact checkers on platforms in some capacity. They do have users who are doing moderation on sites who are trying to flag content that is false or is spam or is scams to try to remove it from you. Does it always work? We're not going to worry too much about that, but they're trying. They're trying to do it. Then the second one is regulation. This is what the governments are doing. This is what policymakers are doing. This goes from a provincial level to a federal level, where governments are trying to impose certain rules and regulations about how companies must manage the content online and what kind of content can exist online. And this can get really tense because you can see people talk about free speech, for example, becomes a common conversation when the government starts to tell people what they can and cannot put on social media. But governments are trying their best to work within, well, some governments are trying within their best to work within those systems to implement regulation around it. And last but not least, media literacy. This is the education angle, and this is what we'll talk a bit more about when we get to the idea of what you can do. But this is using programming and curriculum to teach people the basics of using and understanding media so that they fall prey less to false content on their feed. Um, and so I'm going to go through each of these again with some examples to kind of really ground what's actually being done. So from the moderation side, right, that is what the companies are doing. I don't know if any of you are avid Facebook users, but during the pandemic, we saw a lot of banners like the one on, I think it would be the left side of your screen, the gray box one, which was if there was false content online and it was eventually caught and flagged and reported by the platform or the third party actors the platform hires to check content, a little banner would come up that would let you know that the post was misleading and it would tell you why it was misleading. You also have sites like Twitter, which have something called community notes, which allow the users, so you and I, to try to correct people who make false sentences. Now, Twitter's been called out numerous times now for being quite a hot spot for fake information, and community notes sometimes only feed into the fire because it's just users doing the thing. However, sometimes community notes can provide sources of information to correct them. These are some systems that the platforms are using. I would argue that some are working better than others, but these are some of the approaches of moderation that are happening out there. Then we have regulation. This is what the government's doing. Some of you might have heard or noticed that there's less news on Facebook. Facebook won't actually let you link to news sites anymore. And that's because the Canadian government tried to issue a bill called Bill C-18 that was trying to have the platforms pay those companies money, so pay our news companies a small fee for having their links on Facebook. And the reason the government wanted to do that, at least cited in the bill, was because social media has kind of taken a lot of eyeballs away from our news companies. Our news industry in Canada is losing money and it's struggling to make money. And because of that, they were thinking this bill would allow them to get some of the money back that social media siphons from them from just housing the articles there. Because a lot of people don't always click the links. And if they do, then it goes to the platform, and that's great. But sometimes they just look at the headlines and move on, right? And we'll talk about the concerns with that in a second. But this bill was trying to do that. Facebook's response was, well, we'll just ban all news because we don't want to pay the bill. And so that's where that tension we're in. Now there's a reopening of discussions. The bill's probably going to change, but that's why right now you're not seeing it. And it's a good example of how governments are trying to regulate content on social media, and if it can or cannot work, because there's a lot of tension and minutia to what's going on there. The last example was media literacy. This is the education side. You might have heard of a group called Media Smarts Canada. They're a nonprofit that makes curriculum and lesson plans to try to teach people about dangers of digital culture. So stuff like cyberbullying to stuff like fake news. There's also groups like Snopes. I don't know if you've heard of Snopes before. They are a website that tries their best to fact check claims. So this is a screenshot of them fact checking a claim that Stanley Cups were invented by World War II pilots. And if you go through the article on Snopes, they go through what they did to fact check it and what conclusion they came to, which in this case was that it was false. And you can read the whole kind of the myth that was being suggested, which is the Stanley Cup myth here, and then how they disproved it and what was the actual correct way answer to the question, if there is one. And so those kind of platforms are trying their best to inform the public about some of these issues. So we've talked about these terms, all these big terms. We've talked about why we should care to a point. We've talked about a little bit what's being done. Now we're going to get to the bread and butter, everyone. The thing that you're probably most excited about. Maybe, I don't know. But it's how could you actually deal with it? And so I like to start this with actually telling a story about some of the work that I do, because the importance of how you can deal with it is sometimes lost on people. And so last year I was in Europe, giving a talk with cadets from different militaries about media literacy. And I won't go into the reasons that I was there. It's a larger event. But at one point, I got to talk with soldiers from the Ukraine, who had come, and we'd play games together that talked about media literacy. And I showed them one of my games, and I was pretty nervous because I was like, this must be weird for you, like leaving a war scenario to come to this event to play a game, knowing that there's a war happening back home. And the soldier looked at me and he went, Scott, I won't lie to you. I was pretty skeptical that I was coming here to play a game. However, in playing the game, I realized that my country is fighting two wars. I'm fighting a war on the front lines with the equipment that I'm using, but there's a war that my friends and family are fighting when it comes to information, specifically from Russia in their case. And he hadn't thought about the fact that even though he's on the front lines of one, citizens are on the front lines of another, that he can't do a ton to stop. And he said that that's something that he hadn't thought about, and he was really grateful for learning. And for me, it's always stuck back that someone who's in a very physical war is still recognizing the dangers and value of making sure citizens are aware of how to figure out what is true and what is false online. And so I tell you this because we're going to talk about some of the things you can do. And the biggest challenge we have when it comes to responding to false content is motivating. People can sometimes learn what to do, but if you don't take the steps to do it, it doesn't matter. If you don't take the steps that I've taught you on how to fact check, it doesn't matter if you're still going to share the posts, agree with the posts, click on the posts. The point of this is that those posts, when you come across them, or that content, when you come across it, you can be more skeptical of. You can have that critical eye and hopefully not fall prey for it and not share it further. So fact checking is the thing that people will always talk about. It's the steps that we can take to see if content is true or false. What I have on this slide here is what a paid fact checker would typically do, which is they go through 3 steps. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell you a simpler version because you're not going to get paid to fact check, unfortunately. So what you can do when it's not your day job. But what the people who are paid to fact check typically do is they first verify a claim. So let's say get a claim that online. We'll do a silly one of like chocolate is good for you. So let's say they find that claim and they want to see if that's true or false. The first thing they're going to do is they're going to determine that that's the claim they want to look at. Then they're going to explore the credibility or plausibility of that statement. So is chocolate good for you? They'll probably look up some articles that will talk about how dark chocolate has some health benefits, or maybe there's an article out there about the calcium in chocolate that's good for you. But they'll also find some articles that will talk about, the dangers with how much fat and sugars in chocolate, especially milk chocolates, that aren't good for you. And they'll kind of try to verify that general claim. And once they kind of have a lot of these sources and ideas, they'll investigate, which means they'll look at who's writing the articles, whose sources are they using, what's the research being done, who's the research being funded by, to kind of get some answers. So they might find that an article that was telling you that all the calcium in milk chocolate is good for you, maybe it's funded by Cadbury telling you that their chocolate actually has a health benefit, when in reality you probably shouldn't be eating a ton of Cadbury chocolate even though it's delicious. But they would do the work to check those credentials there. They'll consider what's overlooked, forgotten, and try to weigh both sides. And from there, by weighing both sides and then investigating the validity of the claims by seeing, the sources, the steps being done to prove the claims being made, they can start to come to a conclusion. And when they come to that conclusion, they will document it. And they'll document it to record what they found on both sides, and then they'll write a statement that dictates what the research they found would show, which is kind of what Snopes does if you ever look at their website with how they kind of layer and show out those pieces. And so those are a lot of steps, right? They have to verify the claim, they have to look at extra sources, they have to investigate it all, and then they have to document it. That's a lot of steps for us to do. And so if I in my media literacy course, which is what I teach right now, and I'm supposed to teach people how to fact check, these are the steps that I'm supposed to tell people to do. And so I'm going to tell you the steps that you're going to do, and then I'm going to take a step back and we're going to reflect on how long these steps takes, and maybe there's a faster way to do some of the early flagging so you don't always have to do all these steps. So fact checking for you, so you're not gonna, this is the version for the not paid people, unfortunately. You're still gonna verify, right? So you come across a post, you see a post that says, chocolate's good for you. You're gonna be like, okay, I'm gonna look into this. And so you're gonna check who's the author of the post that's telling you that it's not, the chocolate's good for you, and where's that post posted? Is it on a random blog? Is it on a news site? Is it coming from a journal article? Who's telling you? What's the source? Then you're going to investigate it. You're still going to do these steps as before, right? You're going to look at the claims in the article, you're going to look at the sources provided, and you're going to look at the biases in the text. Are they funded by Cadbury? Because then they probably have a biasy towards how much they want you to like chocolate, right? And instead of doing the documentation, you can do the documentation if you want, but that's an extra step of labor and time that most of us won't have. But typically, if we take the time to look at the author, look at the site, and look at some of the core claims, so 1 or 2 or 3 claims being made, you can get a good idea of what they're telling you is true or false in that space. But if you're ever still confused, and this is something people always forget, you can ask. And what I mean by that is you can sometimes just ask your question into Google and look at some of the other sources that are talking about it. Always a great thing to do. But you can also ask experts. If you were to like talk to someone who's a teacher or at your local university and you'd be like, hi, like I read this article that's telling me that this is false, can you correct this for me? Or like I think this is wrong, can you just let me know what I like if I'm thinking correctly? A lot of those people will probably respond to you and let you know. I know as myself being a scholar, I know many other scholars that if someone asks us a question, especially about the work that we're doing, we're almost always happy to share the information that we're doing. A lot of people who work in these spaces, they believe that knowledge is meant to be shared. And so asking your questions to them is a way to actually get your answers in even more depth if you're ever unsure. But that still seems like a lot of steps. And so at the end of the day, one of the big things that we're trying to teach people is how to critically think. And this is like a term that we hear all the time. And I'm not going to do the thing that a lot of academics like to do, which is break down definitions for 20 minutes about what it means to critically think and get into like philosophy of thinking. But there's kind of 2 core dimensions when we talk about critical thinking that I want you to keep in mind. Because critical thinking is the ability to critically interrogate or analyze the information in the world around us. But more importantly, in that, it comes to how do we position ourselves and how do we respond to the information we're seeing. So it's not just being like, oh, I know something about this, I'm going to therefore determine the answer. It's knowing how we think about something, how we're coming to something, and how we respond to something. So, for example, are you open to consider alternative perspectives to the point that was being made? Are you willing to explore the information that's there and be informed about it? Or have you settled that this is the only correct answer and you're going to move on? And if you ever find yourself in such a rigid space, ask yourself why that is such an assured stance in your heart. Are you able to withhold judgment? So as you look to other perspectives, are you able to look at them without judging them intensely? Because that's going to also cloud how you see those pieces. Additionally, how we respond to information. Can we seek clarification? Can we empathize where others are coming from, where their position's coming from, why their experiences are leading them to think that way? And can we infer intentional or unintentional meaning? So the layers behind what's going on. And what I get to in a lot of the work that I'm doing is that we actually just need to be changing our approach. One of the bastion phrases of the conspiracy groups that I've looked at um, is do your own research. They'll always tell you to do your own research. And if you think about what I just told you when it comes to fact checking and critical thinking, that kind of sounds similar to me just telling you to do your own research, right? I was like, verify the source, look it up a little bit, examine what's going on. That sounds very similar to do your own research. Now, the variance here is that a lot of that do your own research is not under the idea of doing so with a critical lens. They want you to.
Scott, your audio seems to have cut out. Scott, if you can hear me, we see your lips moving, but I'm not getting any audio. Okay, we're gonna try to get Scott's attention. Everybody just stand by. He might not hear us if his audio cut out, so we're just gonna wave at him. Scott, we have a problem. No, we don't hear you. Maybe his Bluetooth batteries died. We're just gonna give him a moment to get his headset back online. Sorry, everyone, for the interruption.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, you're back now.
I'm so sorry. When did I disappear? At the start of the
Uh,
slide?
No, so the last thing we heard, you were talking about how they said do your own research, but they weren't doing it with a critical lens, or we weren't doing
Okay,
it.
so you only last like a minute. Okay, cool,
Yeah, pick that
cool.
up from there. Yeah.
Apologies, everyone. They just randomly turned off. Well, I'm glad that you can hear me again.
Yes, thank you for fixing that.
Yes, so conspiracy groups will do the thing of like do your own research, which sounds very similar to what I was just telling you there. Um, and the difference is conspiracy groups do so through a lens of skepticism, which is they're asking you to question and challenge every single thing that you come across, which typically when you're doing it in that state, you'll disregard a lot of authoritative sources. You're supposed to question the government, you're supposed to question mainstream media, you're supposed to question all the experts, because clearly there's a larger narrative behind it. Whereas critical thinking asks you to be critical of these things and not skeptical. So you're supposed to be like, okay, the mainstream media is telling me this, and this is why the mainstream media is telling me this. This alternative site is telling me this, and this is maybe why this one's telling me this. And so instead of being like, we're going to try to disregard everything and come to our own conclusion from it, we're trying to weigh the opinions of other things and come to our conclusions from it. And so one of the things I say is, if you're engaging with content and you read it and you go, oh, that sounds about right, that is actually a very scary phrase to think, because it means that you've come to a point where you're able to just be like, I mean, I don't know if that's true, but it sounds about right. It means that you've established this kind of worldview and perspective where content will start to feed into it. And they might be a right claim, but it means that that is susceptible for you to fall prey to actually misleading content in that area. When I'm like, oh, yeah, that sounds about right when it comes to like I don't know, something to do with chocolate, we'll say, 'cause that's the example we had, then I'm more likely to just be like, okay, yeah. So if someone said to me, I'll break down the example. Sorry. If someone said to me, yeah, chocolate's like really good for you because of the calcium, and I'm like, yeah, that sounds about right. It's because I now have this idea that I love chocolate, and therefore I don't want to challenge that perspective. Now, of course, this is a silly example. When we get to politics, when we get to, geopolitics like wars and larger events, that just sounds about right can be actually a death sentence for us just falling down a hole of believing a certain perspective and worldview in that regard. And so when I talk about changing our approach, what I'm getting at is we focus too much on content. Fact checking tells us to focus on the content that we're seeing. And it's important to do that. It's important to make sure the content that we're seeing is true. But we actually need to focus on how we, as people, come to understand that content and what larger systems are in play for us to see that content. A lot of the time, we view issues as black and white. Media likes to portray it that way. Social media likes to portray it that way. When in reality, a lot of issues are gray. There's a lot of potentially yes, potentially no. There's a lot of minutia to what's going on. And so by focusing just on content, we can get caught up in the correct or false, yes or no, good, bad dichotomy. But when we focus on why we're seeing that content, why we as individuals are engaging with content that way, we can sometimes come to more of a understanding of the gray that is these systems and issues that we're coming to. And so when we're fact checking, when we're critically thinking, I encourage you not to just think about, is chocolate good for you, but to think about why this person is telling me that chocolate's good for me, or why this article is appearing to me about why chocolate is good for me. And so I'm going to revise those fact checking steps I told you into 3 steps that are hopefully easier for you to just raise flags when you look at content, so that you're not spending tons and tons of time looking up everything, but you're thinking about what you're looking at to be at least more critical moving forward. And so the very first thing is actually quite simple. When you see a post, stop for literally like 1 to 5 seconds, reflect, and ask, why are you seeing this post? Is it something that your friend sent you? Why would they send this to you? Is it something that's been recommended to you? Why is it being recommended to you? Stop, reflect, and ask why. That should take you only a handful of seconds to do. And the purpose of this is to have you take that step back and wonder why this post exists and how you're engaging with it. Here's an example of a post. Oh, I accidentally just turned off my video in trying to click next. I'm back. Here's the example of a post. This was on my YouTube about a month ago now. I'm not going to play the video because it's an ad and it's a whole thing. It's a bit blurry, but it says, for those who can't read it effectively, there's an image of Justin Trudeau here. We got the nice Canadian flag in the background, and it says, "I am Justin Trudeau, a partner at Royal Bank with a fortune of over $200 million. And then it continues on about telling me how the bank has this new program where if I click the button below, I can get a bunch of money as a part of this pool of $200 million. And if I were to play the video for you, you would hear Justin Trudeau's voice. But if you took a second to stop and really reflect on what you're seeing, you would notice that the words of the video don't match up with his lips, because someone's replaced the audio with a fake audio of Justin Trudeau saying all these words to make this video. And that's what we would call a deep fake, if you've heard the term before, which is making a false video about someone saying a certain thing. But if we take a second to stop and reflect, there's kind of 2 things that probably come up. One, I'm seeing this video. Why? Because I'm a Canadian citizen, and clearly I'm wanting money. I mean, I am a student, so I'm always down to make some extra cash. But also the video itself is clearly, there's something wrong with it, because I'm seeing this weird disconnect between what's being said and what's the lips would suggest are being said. And if you watch a bit further, you can also start to get very critical of like, okay, well, so would the government ever just start handing out money through Bitcoin? Probably not. That's not a thing that's happening. And if we spent time to actually examine these things, we would see it doesn't lead to a government site. This isn't actually something Trudeau said. We can also see that it's an advertisement on YouTube. It's not actually the real video that I was trying to watch. And that stopping and reflecting can immediately raise flags so that we're not going further down this piece. And so the question of why are we seeing this content, or why do we see content online? There's three main things. It's personalized, it can be targeted, or it can be tied to money and power. So personalization. Social media wants to keep you engaged, so it makes content that it thinks you want to see. It tries to show you what you like. Targeted campaigns. Various groups benefit from you engaging with their content. I said before that you clicking on posts, or you liking videos, or you sharing videos helps generate money for those who made those videos or posted those videos. And some groups also benefit, like in the case of this video I just showed you. If you were to click that and engage with it, they're going to try to scam you into giving you money, which leads us to that third point of they can make money from doing these things, right? So a lot of it comes back to making money, but it also comes back to power, where we can sometimes manipulate people to think a certain way. So that was step one, right? Was to stop, reflect, and act. Why? That should take you 5 seconds, maybe 10 seconds if you're feeling like spending some more time thinking. Always good to spend more time thinking if you want to do it. Step two is to consider your own reaction. And what I mean by that is when you look at a post, consider how you feel, how the post makes you feel, the emotions that are involved in that. I'm going to show you an image on the next slide from a news article. And the image is meant to evoke a certain feeling. So this is an image of people laying on the side of the street. They're clearly not doing well. You're going to feel some kind of emotions in regard to here. You also have a title here which says Ottawa denies Alberta's drug hunt scheme. And so there's a framing of this image to make you think, and reasonably so, that it's tied to drug use in Alberta. And what this image is going to do is it's going to make you perhaps feel frustrated, or empathy, or anger, or sadness, or I mean, a variety of different feelings are going to come up. I can't speak for how you're going to feel, but those are some of the feelings that I might have when I'm looking at an image like this. And it's meant to do that, right? When we get emotional about things, we want to engage with them a little bit more, or our feelings kind of evoke us to act a certain way. When we tie that into the words deny and scheme, we also start to get framed to think a certain way. Emotions are really powerful. And so after stopping and reflecting why I'm seeing this, asking how I'm feeling about it is important too, because that frames how we engage with it, right? If I'm looking at this and I'm feeling pain and empathy and sympathy and a little bit of frustration because something was denied here, how are we not helping these people? Then I'm going to have a certain perspective that I'm going to read this article from. And so what I'm getting at is that the way content makes us feel can drive how we interpret it and engage with it. And so understanding how we're feeling about content is really important for understanding how we may or may not be being manipulated, but also how we're understanding things. And I'm not saying this because our feelings aren't important. Your feelings are important and your feelings are valid. You're allowed to feel pain and sadness and anger around these posts, but recognizing that you're feeling these things and recognizing how they might shift your opinion on the thing is important, because people like to use emotions to garner support for certain things. Our gut reactions sometimes can throw us off. Our emotions can cloud our perspective. It's very common for a lot of misleading content to reference children who are in pain, or children who are starving, or children who are hungry. And it's really, really sad that they do that, because it's really, really sad that children are in pain and hungry and starving. But doing so to try to manipulate people is even, for me, that evokes an emotion of anger, because we shouldn't be manipulating the pain of certain groups to try to manipulate the public further. But people do that, and it's important to recognize that it's happening, and it's important to recognize what kind of emotions it's trying to evoke in me and how I'm responding back to those. And so once we've been able to stop and reflect, why are we seeing things, and then how are we feeling, which are the first two steps, the third step, if that hasn't triggered a lot of flags, is then do that fact-checking step, which is where you can then do the examining and looking up. So the stopping, reflecting, asking why you're seeing it and how you're feeling should raise some flags. It should be like, okay, this is really trying to make me emotional. Why is it trying to make me emotional? This is something that I'm seeing on my feed. I have some questions here. And as long as you have some flags raising, that should be enough for you to say, you know what, this is probably something I don't want to share more. So if you just want to move on, just move on and don't engage with it further. But if it's something that you actually care about because that emotional response was a lot, or maybe you actually are curious, that's when you go to the third step, which is where you spend some time to look it up. And so what I refer to as the rapid fact check is to kind of actually go back through the steps of like, okay, so the headline had emotional language. That's actually a very good sign that a headline is trying to mislead you or at least engage you in a certain direction. And we see this happening more and more and more. This image on the side of your screen, the fonts are probably a bit small and I apologize for that, but pretty much it's showing how since 2000 to 2019, we saw emotions and headlines go up. Anger, disgust, fear, joy, sadness were all more common in how news headlines were sent to people, whereas neutral headlines that try not to have emotional language were actually less common. And so we see that this is a common practice. But quickly knowing who the author is, how accurate their other works are, can be enough to actually let you know if a source is true or false. If you look up an author and you realize that they consistently are spreading content that is misleading, or they're consistently been fact checked, or they consistently have had content that is flagged for misleading, it's probably not worth trusting what that author's sharing, right? If someone's consistently been known to lie, they're probably not worth spending your time to keep reading from. Even though sometimes people who lie can tell the truth, once you have, it's the boy who cried wolf. Once you have said things enough, it's really hard for us to believe them. And the same goes for sources. You can, if you come across a news site and you've never heard of the news site before, you can actually go to Google, you can type in the news site, and you can just type in the words after fake news. And actually, most of the time, it will let you know very quickly. You can give, this is obviously not the most accurate claim, but it will let you see if that site has been flagged a lot for spreading fake news. And if it has, it's also probably not the most trustworthy source. That doesn't mean that you should discredit everything on it, but it does mean that we can sometimes be more critical of what we're seeing. And so that third step where we start doing the investigation, you start taking that once some flags have started pinging up that the content that you're looking at is targeting you or trying to mislead you, because then you can look up and see what it's actually trying to teach you. So here's an example of kind of a fake news post. This is from RT, which is a news site called Russia Today, which the name alone should tell you some of the biases or perspectives of the news site. Additionally, Russia Today, being a Russian news site, actually writes a lot of its content in English. So if we stop and reflect and ask why would a Russian news site be writing a lot of its content in English and not Russian? And the simple answer is that because Russia Today is not actually targeting the Russian public, it's targeting spreading Russian perspective of news in English-speaking countries. And this specific post is from 2020, where an Austrian lawmaker, this is the headline, tests cola for COVID and claims positive results returned, showing his test is worthless. And so the headline, without reading any of the text of the story, is trying to tell us that COVID tests are worthless in some capacity. It's using very the word positive is in all caps, right? It's trying to draw our attention to it. Worthless is in quotes. It's using language that's trying to already tell us how to think, right? It's trying to tell us COVID result tests are worthless. And obviously, there's research out there, but the efficacy of COVID tests, that's not what I'm here to talk about today. What I'm here to talk about is how we can flag an article very quickly for perhaps trying to mislead us, right? Then if you actually read the article, there's actually a line in it that says the Austrian lawmaker administered the test incorrectly, skipping an important step before checking the sample for the virus, right? So if we actually read the article, it's telling us that the test, the headline is so adamant was able to tell us it was worthless, was done incorrectly. And therefore, it's kind of just a nothing post where it's just saying someone did a thing, they did the thing wrong, and it gave them results, but we can't trust those results because they did the thing wrong. And if you were to spend time looking up, the Austrian lawmaker, looking up the test, you can get more information about what's going on here and realize that a lot of this is kind of just a sham nothing post. Additionally, if we want to be even more critical, we can talk about how an Austrian lawmaker is doing the test. Why isn't a scientist doing the test? Why isn't someone who's, in the medical field the one doing the test? Why is this a post about an Austrian lawmaker? Well, there's a politician involved, and politics got really tied into COVID and how we voted and how we thought. And so there's another reason kind of layer to what's going on. And so step one, just to do a quick review, we did the reflect and ask why. Step two, How are we feeling about it? If that has raised enough flags, then we move to step 3 and we maybe look up a little bit, read the article a little bit, see if there's anything in it immediately that kind of gets us there. Step 4, we go back to our gut reaction. We compare it to what we've learned and we think, okay, so when I first came across this post, this is how I felt, this is how it wanted me to feel. I've now maybe done some extra work. Do I still feel this way? And if you do, that's fine. Maybe the post was right. Maybe it just was an emotional post. You had a response and it was a correct post, and that's great. Maybe it was different. And if it was different, ask yourself why it was different and reflect on that a little bit. And so in summary, when engaging with content online, we need to ask why we're seeing it, what it's telling us, and how we respond to it. We need to contemplate how our perspective, of the world is not everyone's perspective of the world, right? Social media has done a really great thing of letting us connect with people across the world, but sometimes that means that we're connecting with ideas and viewpoints that aren't our own, and it can sometimes feel challenging and difficult to come across those viewpoints. But that's okay. It's okay to be challenged. It's just okay to make sure how we're coming to those challenges. We're not supposed to build walls. We're supposed to be sometimes open to those conversations. And so what is left? I said this before and I'll say it again. We need to remember that almost every issue is gray. So the idea of right and wrong, the idea of good and bad, those don't really exist when we get to how these issues work. One of the examples that I talk about in one of my classes with my students is murder. We have this little thing where I'm like, okay, who here thinks murder is wrong? And almost all of them raise their hand because we're like, murdering people is wrong. And then we have a larger conversation about, are there ever cases where murder can be justified? Are there ever situations where there's a murder that could be arguably morally good? And this gets into like a very philosophical question where we talk about, well, last time a student brought up the trolley problem, where like, do you have the train hit one person as opposed to hit like 500 people? But you get into these conversations where sometimes even these moral lines that we've established of right and wrong has minutia to it when we contextualize it, when we put it in context with other things that are going on. And so having opinions and feelings are okay, but I want you to remember to recognize your limits, your own biases, and your own knowledge. One of the key things to remember is that we don't know everything. Even if we think we know a lot of things about something, we don't. And you can talk to any academic who has started studying a field, and they will talk about how the more they studied it, the more questions they had. It's rare that you talk to someone who's an academic who, when they study something, they had all their questions answered. Also, if we had all our questions answered, we wouldn't be studying it anymore. And it's quite common that people who are less aware of a subject actually feel more confident in their knowledge of a subject than people who are more aware of a subject. And so also, not to be rude to your friends who are really confident, but sometimes question their confidence because they might not actually know as much as they think they know about certain topics. And it's quite a common fallacy and challenge. And so as we wrap up to the end, I want you to remember that issues have multiple dimensions to them. Recognizing what we know and don't know is the most critical part. Our knowledges and experiences are subjective, and recognizing that we come across fragments and ideas at different times in our lives, whether it's online or in conversations with people, can be a powerful defense to recognizing how we're engaging with them and what they're trying to tell us. And so I titled this presentation Navigating Truth Online because we went through the steps that you should take in confirming the legitimacy of content. But in reality, the title of this presentation should have probably been Navigating Truth in Our Own Lives, where we are in a constant tension between what we believe and know and what we don't know. And balancing that tension is really tough, and being reflective and critical is the key to kind of engaging in that tension. So I hope this was helpful for you. If you have any questions, I'm happy to start talking about these things. We covered a lot in what I think was 50 minutes. So thank you for your patience and energy. And so I'm going to briefly stop talking because I think Andrew is going to be sending some of your questions my way. But I hope this was helpful. And if you do have questions, I have an email and all those things. If you want to contact me, I'm happy to talk about these things further. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
All right, well, thank you so much, Scott. That was a super informative presentation. And I think we all learned a great deal about fake news and how to handle some steps going forward. I do have some questions. Some are put in the chat. Some people sent privately to me. I guess the first one I want to ask is, how would you decipher between what is fake news, so stuff that is maybe a blatant lie, and stuff that is maybe biased news or different opinions? How would you determine what they're trying to do there?
So actually, a lot of news isn't blatantly fake. We talk a lot about how news is like kernels, or like false news is like kernels of truth, which means they'll take something that happened and they'll spin it and they'll engage with it into a way that explodes it into something not actually true. But to answer your question very simply, sometimes when we talk about news articles, you can just look at like how the news article is framed. So an opinion piece, right, an op-ed, that's going to be full of opinion, and you should recognize that it's full of someone's opinion. But if it's not framed as an op-ed, and you're reading it and you're noticing a lot of bias and a lot of opinion in how it's being framed, you should be a little bit wary of why so much bias is in the piece. There should be a flag to kind of check out what's going on here, what's happening here, and why it's being framed that way. And so blatantly fake news, though, is also sometimes a lot easier to catch because it's entirely false. Like one of the articles that I've talked about with my students is like there was an article that came out and went viral in 2020, I think it was, where it said that the Pope endorsed Donald Trump, and it went viral. But all the students were like, "Well, that sounds ridiculous." And if you look anything up on it, like the moment you type it in, you can find that it's not real. Those other posts, right, where you have like something that's really biased or really opinion heavy, there's going to be something truthful there, right? Because like in the other case, the Pope never actually endorsed Donald Trump, so it's very easy to disprove that. But in a case where there's a little bit of truth there, it becomes hard to decipher it, and that's where reflecting on what it's telling you, the messages behind it, if there's a bias, is the bias coming from the author or the sources or the framing, that becomes more that taking down and tearing it apart piece.
Okay, so great. And then I think you kind of touched on this during your presentation, but I'm going to ask you, yes, maybe a bit more point blank. Who does the burden for doing all this kind of fact checking? Who do you think, or who should, in a perfect world, who should it fall to? Should it be the individual? Should it be the companies? Should it be government? Who would be best placed to regulate that kind of content?
Yeah, my heart wants to say the companies, and the reason I say that is because the companies at the end of the day are the ones that, if we're talking about digital content, are the ones with the platforms that host and maintain that content. But the realist in me recognizes that they can't actually control, like they have millions and billions of users on some of these sites, right? And to manage every single piece of content that comes across their feed is near impossible without them using bots or algorithms that block content. And then we get to people getting concerned that their voices are being silenced and not discussed. And so I do actually think it's this idea more of community, where the platforms themselves should have ownership over how viral and how visible false content gets online, right? So like if someone posts a lie but no one spreads it, it doesn't really have an impact. But if someone posts a lie and it goes everywhere, the platform should be catching that and removing it for sure. However, we as users still have a right to be posting and sharing truthful content. And it's sad, as I said in the presentation, that there's entire industries of people whose job is to post false content online. But there are those of us whose job isn't to post false content online. And for that means, unfortunately, we have to take the burden of being more critical and being careful about what we share. Because like I just said, if a post doesn't have visibility, it doesn't have power. It doesn't have spread. It doesn't have growth. And so if we're able to catch what is false and not spread it further, not engage with it further, we can actually limit the power that it has or limit the impact it has. And so that isn't to say that we're responsible when something goes viral, but that we can have responsibility for stopping it from going viral. I think the governments actually have the hardest part, because any single time a government tries to deal with a social media platform, they actually annoy both their citizens and the company, and there's kind of no winning for them, because then you have people yelling at the government for taking away their TikTok, but then you also have TikTok yelling at the government for dealing with their like the way they do business. And so governments have the hardest time, but I do think governments should be working hard to try to help foster that community where content doesn't last, and building policies that actually allow for more transparency to us as users about how content is being seen, spread, and dealt with, especially during times of elections, which we see is a kind of growing concern in Canada right now.
So you say that. So policies are great, but they're very contentious. Government can't just say, "Hey, stop doing that." It runs into a whole bunch of free speech issues, and people get upset about that. So I guess, are there any new innovative technologies that might help government get to that point with detecting deep fakes, so they can put stuff online, or people can use even to I don't know, scan articles that say this is clearly biased or fake? Anything coming forward, or anything already out there?
Yeah, I mean, if we want to get into the conversation of AI, we can talk about how there is now artificial intelligence programs, which I know sounds big and scary for those who are not familiar with AI for me to say artificial intelligence programs. But pretty much what that means is it's a website where you can take an article, you can copy the article, or sometimes even the link to the article, and paste it in the website and ask it, is there bias in this? Is there truth in this? And what the bot does is it reads the language and tries to tell you if the language is trying to lean a certain way. Now, AI is something that everyone keeps talking about. It's a hot button thing, and people like to talk about it. And I'm still quite skeptical about the promises of AI and what it can do. But there is, for especially summarizing academic articles, there are AI that are really good at giving you like abstracts of what an article is telling you, so you don't have to read the whole thing. Especially because reading what academics write can be a lot. It can be tough, and so having bots that do that can help. You also do see that companies like have bots that will like if you spam. So if I post the same thing, like if I post the message "chocolate is good for you" with like a link 1,000 times on Facebook, my account will get caught, banned, and removed because they have a bot that will just see that I'm posting the same thing over and over again and will remove it. Governments have a harder time doing that with bots. The actual answer for governments is to create coalitions with other nations. And we saw this in Europe. So in Europe, they have something called the GDPR, which is just the name of this council of different European groups that have made policy regulations for all these European countries together. It's part of those who are in the EU Union. And I don't know if people are familiar with kind of the history of tech, but you know how today when you go on a website and you get like a little box that says, "Would you like to accept these cookies?" And you have to click like yes or no, or you can change how you look at these cookies on the website. That's because the GDPR put a policy in place that companies have to be transparent about if they're tracking users, which is what cookies do. I don't know why we use the word cookies because it sounds cute and fun. It actually means that platforms are taking your data and tracking you online. And so they ask you about cookies because the GDPR made it mandatory that they do, and if they don't, they get fined a ton of money. And it worked because all those countries were like, if you don't do this, your websites get banned in our country. And so for Canada to be like Bill C-18, if you have other countries who are also supporting that decision, you can have enough power to push back against these companies. But because they're so big, it's really hard for them to do.
Okay, so I have a question that it might be a bit out of your scope, so you can feel free to say I don't feel comfortable answering that. But we talked a lot today about news stories and articles and stuff like that, and that could be Googled or researched. How would you identify fake or incorrect or fake news, I guess, fake stories coming from a personal account that has maybe been hacked? You know, I have friends who've had their Instagram account and then they're soliciting other friends for money, and you're just like, that's weird, but sure, why not? Is there a good way of detecting that one where you don't necessarily can't really Google, is this a real thing?
I mean, so if it's coming from your friends, the first thing to do is be like, is this normal for my friend to send me? Or if like it's like one of those like friends of a friend that's on your social media, go and check like, is it common for them to send these kind of things? Never click a link that gets sent to you in a message, especially when it's randomly from a friend. And this is actually like one of the very big scams you see right now is people messaging you being like, oh my gosh, did you hear that this person died? And then they don't actually tell you the specifics. And then they just send a link to an obituary that's actually a scam. But you'll click it because you're like, oh my gosh, who died? I'm really worried and I want to know, right? And if it comes from a friend, you're even more likely to believe it. And so if something like that ever comes across your feed, where like someone sends you a link, but it's not like fully descriptive of what that link's going to send you, message the friend back, maybe on a different platform, right? If their Facebook's been hacked or their Instagram's been hacked, so give them a little phone call, send them a text, message them on something else, because that way you can kind of at least avoid if it has been hacked. Typically hackers though don't like spend hours on the platform. They'll hack an account and then a bot will spam message everyone in that account to try to get you to click false links. But the typical thing is message them on another platform if you can. Double check that this is not normal behavior for their account.
Okay, great. I have a kind of a two-part question. So I guess um, someone asked, how would you broach the situation if you feel or you believe that someone close to your family or friend is unawarely or maybe knowingly posting fake news kinds of stuff like that? And how would you broach that subject? And another one is, how do you avoid becoming paranoid of everything either you're reading or someone's posting is fake news?
Yeah, well, that's also why I had that little slide there that was like the internet is good too. Like there's good things here. Don't leave this presentation totally terrified about doom and gloom. Um, and so the first point there of never engage in the comment section. So if someone's posted a false article or they've posted like a very strong opinion piece, and you know how you can like comment on it, engaging in the comment section, what that does is it gives that post more visibility because the platform thinks that people are like, this is cool. People are talking about it. People like it. And so what it's going to do is it's going to let more people see that post because it's like, oh, well, like your friend over here liked this, so you might like this too. And so engaging in the comment sections, even in the comment sections, you're like, this is false. I don't agree with this, which also is probably not the language you should use, but still, is just going to proliferate the post further. So if you have a friend that's spreading a lot of false ideas, my suggestion would be to reach out to them individually, send them a direct message, give them a phone call, and be like, hi, like I noticed that you posted this the other day, and like I personally, like I looked it up and I didn't see like truth in what you were saying. Can you explain it to me a bit further? And also, like, the other thing I'm saying, like when you're confronting people, and there's a big conversation about like how do we talk to people about these things, because it's tough and it can be tough. Um, and never name call. The moment you're like calling someone fake news, the moment you're saying to someone like you're a liar or those kind of things, the moment we use negative language towards another person, the conversation moves from being a conversation to being an argument. And when you're in an argument, emotions will dictate how you go back and forth in ways that's not going to be helpful for anyone, because both people just get further and further into their camps and no progress is made. One of the steps that I like to take when I'm talking with people about false ideas, or like when they have opinions that I don't agree with, is I just like, can you just tell me more about like why you think that way? And I kind of keep asking them different versions of that question as they tell me more and more about their opinion, and we start to peel back the layers of where that's coming from. And so when people tell me, you know, I don't like this certain group of people because of X, Y, and Z, I'm like, can you tell me like why? And have them really reel back the layers as to like where those problematic assumptions come from when we're talking about like racist content. And I recognize that that can be uncomfortable, especially if it's something really close to home. And you have to recognize that sometimes you can't have those conversations, and so sometimes ignoring the person who's posting that false news is the right answer, because it's gonna just, no matter what, you're gonna get upset. But if you are able to handle that discomfort, I encourage you to embrace that discomfort for a bit. Not because I'm encouraging you to be in uncomfortable positions, but being able to try to listen to them and let them get their thoughts out is the chance where you can start to slowly change their mind. No conversation is going to change someone's worldview. There's nothing that I could ever do today that would, to anyone in this audience, that would change the way that they see the world leaving this 50-minute conversation. There's no conversation in the world that will do that to anyone. But the way that we form our understanding of the world is little bits, little conversations, little moments, little experiences that shift slightly how we think. And so if we have those conversations with people where we ask them to kind of break down where they're getting there, we can start to maybe have them think about how they're perceiving the world in a very different way. It's one experience that will lean them to start thinking the other way. And then to the question about avoid becoming paranoid. Well, paranoia, it comes from that kind of over skepticism of everything, right? Where you start to think that everything's a problem, everything's part of this issue, everything's a concern. And I encourage you, when you're evaluating things, is not always assume that it's wrong. Is to be like, okay, how can I make sure that this is right? Like, what can I do to continually prove that this is right? Or what can I do to make sure that this is correct? Because yeah, we could spend all day challenging and assuming everything out there is trying to mislead and misinform us. But at the end of the day, most things actually aren't. While there is a lot of false content online, when it comes to our friends and family, most of them aren't trying to misinform us. Most of them are sharing things from places of love or places of identity or places of passion. And so resting in kind of how people are feeling and people are engaging with the world as opposed to the messages that are being sent is actually a way to be a little bit less paranoid and scared about what's going on and engage more with the community around you. I mean, one of the jokes you see people say online is like, go outside and touch grass. And it's a bit of like a little like poke at someone for like, you've been online too long. But it's also important to recognize that like our life isn't just what happens on a screen, right? Our life isn't just what happens on our phone. And there's so much more to that, where like paranoia comes because we're seeing everything in certain frames. And so I encourage you to break out of those frames to see life in different ways.
That's a great suggestion. Get off the internet sometimes, as good as it is. You don't need to be in front of it all day long and constantly reading the news all day long.
Exactly.
So the final question I have right now, unless people put a few more in the chat, and I'm going to try and lump two into one here. You mentioned fact checking. It's a simple process anyone can do. But how difficult does it get? You know, if you saw one article a day and then you had half an hour to go and fact check it, you could say, well, that one was fake news and I feel good about myself. I listened to that one. Or I didn't listen to that one, sorry. But you're constantly bombarded with headlines. You're scrolling through Facebook. There could be, if you're on for 15 minutes, you might see 15 articles and then 10 other headlines. So you don't always have the time to fact check all of them. Is there maybe even a simpler step to just kind of maybe even with the platform? I think there's ways you can just remove that content from your page, and maybe you can tell people about that. And the second question is, in your opinion, or maybe not just in your opinion, maybe you have facts to prove it, is it getting worse? Are we getting bombarded with more and more fake content or irregulated content or fake news?
Yeah. So I'll start with the first question. I just completely lost my train of thought. The first question was, can you repeat it for me just so I make sure I answer it properly and don't go on a tangent?
Just more like it's, you mentioned ways of fact checking, but that was more if you had one article and you saw it.
So how do we do it faster? Yeah. So that's why I broke it down to those 3 steps after, which is like the first thing when you read a headline, just quickly ask yourself, is this headline trying to make me feel a certain way or trying to evoke a certain response out of me? If so, just be slightly more wary when you're reading a post. Like, just be like, okay, this is clearly an emotional headline. It's trying to make me think a certain way. That doesn't mean it's wrong, because they use those headlines to just make sure you click on their article. But be wary that that is somewhat like a flag that this could be misleading you or misconstruing the post a certain way. You don't have to fact check everything. In fact, I encourage, like, as much as I want to say fact check everything, it's unrealistic, as you're saying. No one's going to do that job. I encourage you to fact check the things that when you read them, you go, oh, that sounds about right. Or when you read them, you go, that sounds crazy. When you either of those phrases, those are the things that you should fact check. Because it's either the thing that's just reinforcing how you see the world, and it's important to double check that what you're reinforcing is actually correct, or it's the thing that's so crazy that you want to make sure that it actually is crazy, or maybe there's actually some validity to it. So if you ever are like, oh, that sounds about right, or oh, that's insane, those are the signs that I would say maybe take an extra minute to just double check that you're agreeing with what's being said there. And now that I was answering that, my train of thought left me on the second question that you asked me. So if you could remind me of that
question
one.
is it getting worse? Like, are we going to be fighting this war forever now? And is it a fool's errand, or is there hope to think it's getting better?
I want to be positive. I want to be positive and say that it's getting better in the sense that we have people who are more aware of how media systems work, and there's actually a growing movement for people to be less tech reliant. And I don't mean that in terms of like their daily life, but in terms of how they understand the world. Like, there's a recognition that there's a lot of false ideas when it comes to social media pages. However, the advent of AI as a tool that can quickly disseminate and create posts does make me nervous, and research does show that there's more and more kind of just general, I don't want to call it garbage per se, but just kind of nothing content being put out. Because if we remember, the internet relies on content to exist. Like, Facebook would be nothing without the content on it, right? If no one posted on Facebook, nothing was existing on the site, it wouldn't actually function. And so content is like the bread and butter, the lifeblood of how social media functions. And so as you have more and more ways to make content easily without actually doing the research in it, and you also have a journalism industry that's slowly getting less and less funding, and so you don't have journalists spending the time and money to do the work that they're supposed to be doing, you're going to have more and more content that is either like simple opinion pieces or kind of somewhat misconstrued because it was quickly put together. And unfortunately, that is a reality that we're seeing happen. But we are, on the flip side, also seeing more citizens become media literate because those campaigns are really getting a push because we're recognizing a problem.
Sorry, so I thought of a last bit question. Maybe you can answer this, maybe you can't. But more, or maybe you don't feel comfortable answering this. But is there a better place or a trusted place that you go to get your news that you feel you should tell people about? Like, maybe Facebook is not the best place you should be finding out your information. Someone comments in the comments saying they're worried about fake news influencing future elections. So ahead of an election coming up, should we go look somewhere else for news?
And these are reasonable fears to have, right? In general, don't get your news off social media if you can avoid it, right? And it's easier said than done because you're just gonna be on social media, you're gonna see it. Don't get your news from just your friends. Like, go to the sources that are messaging the article, right? Like, go to the CBC, go to the CTV, go to the other sides as well. When I get my news, I typically I'll read a news story somewhere. If it's one of those stories where I'm like, oh, that sounds about right, or that's like a little crazy, I'll then try to find a news from a different perspective. So like, you have some news that lean more left and some news that lean more politically right. And so I try to read news on both sides of the spectrum because it let you can read the biases of both and typically come to a story. But that takes extra steps, and that's also part of kind of my job to do. And so I do those things. I also try to read international news just because I find that other countries reporting on Canadian events is a really interesting way to see how people are thinking about Canada. Because if you're not caught up in Canadian politics, if you're just like a newspaper from like when Middle Eastern newspapers report on Canadian politics, it's sometimes a very fascinating space because they have a very different political stance that they're taking on our events. Same with newspapers from South America or Africa or Europe. They take different stances on Canadian politics. So it's sometimes really interesting to read. And in terms of fake news influencing the elections, it's a concern that has been flagged by the Canadian government, and they're trying to do things to recognize that. They're working with the companies right now to try to deal with it. I can't promise you that it's going to be a perfect run where there's not going to be fake news influencing the election. That's actually an impossible task for anyone to do. What I encourage you to do is to actually go to the source. So like when they have debates, go and watch the debate if you can, or watch the recording of the debate. If you are interested in a party, read their platform, read what they're telling you they're trying to do. Go to their messaging and seeing how they're trying to frame the message, and then compare it to how news is doing it. And so there's lots of news sites to check out. And so I encourage you not to just to stick to one, but to stick to many and try to read the same story across many and see why it's there.
Well, Scott, thank you so much. I don't see any other questions in the chat at the moment. People have last minute things they want to ask Scott, please put them in now. But I think we're in for a bit of an uncertainty going forward, and not to exasperate any paranoia, but you raise the point that community news or local news is getting defunded, and then we got to go read local news to find out. So kind of a catch-22, which how are we gonna ensure that we can get good local journalism when that's the funding to that is being cut?
I will say, reading local news supports local news. And if more people read and support local news, it will actually get more funding. Some of their funding is based off of how much engagement they're getting.
Well, there you go. So read your local paper, everyone. That'll go a long way to helping with all these issues and avoid some paranoia. Scott, thank you so much. This is super informative. I think we learned a lot. I think you gave everyone time to think and reflect on how to navigate social media a bit better, and as you say, navigate the truth in our lives. To everyone here, thank you for attending so much. Brendan is going to put a questionnaire in the chat now quickly. Can you please fill that out? It's just so we can get your feedback on how we can improve and do more webinars in the future. Also, if you want to come to some of those webinars in the future, we have 2 remaining for this month. Please sign up for our newsletter. Katya is about to put in our newsletter link. Apart from that, thank you for attending. We're a bit early today, so you just bought yourself 12 minutes of time. Go enjoy. It's nice and sunny outside. Again, Scott, thank you so much. This is wonderful.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure to be here.